welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the show where every week I look at a book which has been very, very important in the development of James Ellroy as a writer, a stylist, and an artist. Ever since I've started the show, I've wanted to do an episode on the work of John le Carre because James has always spoken really highly of le Carre in public and, to me personally. But one of the difficulties has been I've been combing through his comments and I couldn't find any particular book which he'd singled out as a favorite or highly instrumental to him. And then it hit me. The Little Drummer Girl is Helen Canode's, which James Ellroy's wife's, favorite novel, and she has read it endlessly again and again and again, and she has studied it. And it has greatly influenced her two novels. So today's episode is quite special because it's a le Carre episode, and it's also kind of an episode of Helen Reads with an element of Ellroy Reads, because we're going to be looking at this very, very special book, The Little Drummer Girl. So to give you some of the background, John le Carre is the pseudonym of David Cornwall, who was an intelligence officer with MI5 and briefly MI6, the details of which are still a little bit murky. He was always a little bit cagey about that for obvious reasons, partly because he was a patriot, and he strongly believed in the defense of the West, but with many complications and compromises to those beliefs. His politics evolved very in a very radical and interesting way over his 89 years on this earth, and he often surprised me when I saw the development of his politics. I've been reading him since he was a kid. He changed a lot, and The Little Drummer Girl was really part of that change. So this was a mid-career novel for le Carre, and he'd had remarkable success writing the George Smiley novels. What's loosely known as the Smiley versus Carla novels, and he traveled to the Middle East because he had this idea that he might be able to set a Smiley novel in the Middle East. And then he got there and suddenly he suddenly kind of thought it would be hackneyed and kind of cliche to put Smiley in the Middle East fighting his nemesis in Soviet intelligence, Carla. He didn't want to do another Smiley versus Carla tale and just set it in the desert. Another story began to evolve for him, a story involving an English actress named Charlie, who is on the radical left in Britain and involved in the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the radical left as it was at the time in the late 70s, early 80s, who was recruited by Israeli intelligence by a man called Martin Kurtz, who's an Israeli spy master, to track down and infiltrate a Palestinian cell, or more specifically a Palestinian terrorist called Khalil, who is committing terrorist atrocities throughout Europe, particularly targeting Jewish targets. And it's a great story about inner conflict because of Charlie's natural left-wing views, and because of several kind of romantic entanglements she gets involved with along the way of the story. She's really conflicted between the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. Her sympathies are naturally with the Palestinian side, but of course she is also an actress, and performance is very, very important to her. So le Carre was a great researcher and went back to the Middle East. He went to Lebanon, he went to Israel, and he talked to both sides. He got to Israel and he was amazed at just how open the society was. He could talk to members of Mossad, generals. It was all very easy because he realized that Israel is basically a security state. 1 minute you're working as an economics don in a university in Tel Aviv, and the next minute you're at war because Israel's been invaded, and you're called up, and that's kind of natural. And the mission in The Little Drummer Girl is very, very convoluted. I mean, the great thing about the novel is you can read it several times and just pick up on little details about the mission emotionally and also logistically every time. And he actually sketched it out to some Mossad officers, and they were like, well, look, if we thought it would work, we would do it. In fact, Le Carre said, if there's any agency on earth that would try this, it would probably be Mossad, because they're a very, very sophisticated agency, and of course they have a lot of enemies, so they have to think outside the box, launch kind of more aggressive operations than, say, British and American intelligence, which was its philosophy was much more defensive at the time. And then Le Carre also met Yasser Arafat. Believe it or not, he met several PLO members, and he said it was kind of very exciting, having meeting a person and then having to change cars, and then driving another 50 miles, and then having to change cars, and then going out into the desert and seeing the camps, and he really liked Arafat. He felt like he was surrounded by very, very aggressive lieutenants and advisors and that sort of things. But he thought that Arafat, on a personal level, was very gregarious, very charismatic, a born leader with a deep love of the Palestinian people, and he thought it was naturally a real tragedy, this situation, as it was in Israel and Palestine then, and as it is today. His sympathies began to shift a lot towards the Palestinian cause, and he was also very, very sympathetic towards the Jewish Israeli cause, and he felt that was important for him to write a book that was sympathetic to both sides. And he felt like, well, if I'm writing it, and it's not coming from the usual suspects, the usual Israel bashers, if it's coming from someone who's naturally quite supportive of Israel, it might have more impact. And it was quite a moderate position, because I don't think Le Carre was ever quite as conservative as, say, George Smiley, his most famous creation. But he held Western values, certainly in comparison then to Eastern values. He certainly believed in capitalism and democracy much more strongly than he ever believed in. He never believed in communism, and he'd seen the aftermath of the Cambridge Five and those kind of betrayals, and he held a real contempt for Kim Philby and the people who had betrayed their country for ideological reasons, because it had got people killed, and he thought it was just naivety on the biggest level, and self-delusion and narcissism. But then, after he finished the Smiley versus Kohler trilogy, if we want to call it those, that's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, The Honourable Schoolboy, and Smiley's People, he began to turn against George Smiley. He began to feel like Smiley was a fudge. His kind of very kind of soft Anglican faith, his kind of soft Toryism, he began to turn against that quite a lot. And this was probably the start of Le Carre's journey towards a much more radical politics. I mean, radical by his standards, because he didn't return particularly to the Middle East as a topic, but he became much more anti-American. That became the big thing. And I think the end of the Cold War kind of opened his eyes to this, in that he, with novels like The Russia House, he began his kind of love affair with Russia, as an open society and what it could be in the post-Soviet age, and he didn't want it to become too Americanized. He became, I would say, a bit of a bore in his anti-Americanism. And he also turned a lot on his own country, primarily because of Brexit. Brexit really broke his heart, and in the end of his life he took Irish citizenship, which is quite common, but it felt like for him it was specifically an act of rebellion against Brexit. It was almost a rejection of his country, and also a rejection of all the values that had carried him through his career, both as an intelligence officer and the bulk of his career as a novelist. So if you're interested in the development of Le Carre politically and its evolution, it's probably a good one to start, The Little Drummer Girl, because this is his journey towards radicalism, but it's still very twisty-turny and gripping. The story started with Charlie in Greece, and it goes all over Europe. It goes to the Middle East, so you get incredible You get incredible locations and an incredible story about inner conflict and dilemma. And Charlie herself, it was widely assumed that she was based on Vanessa Redgrave, who is now Dame Vanessa Redgrave, who's one of Britain's greatest actresses, but also very well known for her left wing views. Not so much today, but in the 70s, she was involved in the workers' revolutionary parties. In fact, Le Carre more closely modelled her on his sister, Charlotte Cornwall, who was an actress, nowhere near as famous as Vanessa Redgrave, but still, quite successful and a very, very good actress. And she was involved in the radical left. And he was quite, I won't say contemptuous, that sounds a bit mean, but he was a little bit scathing, a little bit kind of comical about what the far left was like in Britain in the 70s, the Angry Brigade and those sorts of things. They're very cultish, they're a bit Judean People's Front, there were so many little splinter groups, and he said that Charlotte's involvement with them, didn't last because I think people get sucked into these groups, and then when they realize that half of them are kind of cranks and loonies and gadflies, then they kind of drift out of them quickly, and then kind of shake themselves free and like, oh, what was I thinking? But that's good because it's part of learning. And Helen Canode, Ellroy's second wife and his current partner, really, really loves this book, and she spent a lot of time in Europe as a young woman and traveling, and a little bit wild, a little bit crazy, a bit like Charlie, and she was quite honest about that, and she really related to Charlie and her struggles, and her two novels, the Ticket Out. The Ticket Out was the first one, and I thought was a fabulous success. It's a mystery revolving around a movie critic in Los Angeles, which is what Helen was as well for many years, a movie critic. I think she's really got some of the strength of Charlie and the understanding of inner conflict, and also being attracted to someone who's kind of like diametrically opposed to you, which is in many terms what Ellroy and Helen are like. Ellroy's very, very conservative, and Helen's very left wing. And when they first met, she was modeling herself as this girl Bolshevik figure. So Charlie really meant a lot to her. I made the mistake of once asking Helen, well, what do you think about the two film adaptations? And gosh, she hated them. There's a 1984 film adaptation of this, directed by George Roy Hill, who did The Sting and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, so a very successful director, and starring Diane Keaton as Charlie. Diane Keaton's one of the greatest actresses of all time, but it doesn't work at all. I mean, changing Charlie from British to American was a bit of a, because the story is kind of so British from Charlie's angle. The whole kind of British far left of the 1970s, think of the strikes and just the kind of industrial unrest and the militancy that was coursing through Britain at the time. And the film is just dull. You've got Klaus Kinski as Martin Kurtz, and it just doesn't work at all. Then, a few years ago, there was a BBC adaptation of The Little Drummer Girl, produced by Le Carre's sons, who have taken on the task of producing all of Le Carre's work recently for their own production company. And I thought it was really good. It had Florence Pugh as Charlie, and Alexander Skarsgård, and Charles Dance, a fabulous cast. And being a six-parter, it could tell the story, Michael Shannon as well, tell the story, a complicated story. It can stretch it out over 6 hours. They could get most of the story in. And I made the mistake of telling Helen I like this, and she's just like, oh, God, how could you? I mean, she's like, Florence Pugh. I mean, if she's Charlie, I'm Harry Truman. She was quite scathing about it, but I'd say check it out. I mean, one of the interesting things about Le Carre is that his work has been adapted time and time and time again. And Ellroy hasn't had that luck so far. And the great irony of this is that Le Carre, he didn't like the label spy novelist. He wanted the label novelist. He wanted to be, and he was, one of these great literary figures, not a genre novelist. But the only kind of non-genre novel he wrote was The Naive and Sentimental Lover, which is based on a love triangle that he got in. And it was panned. It was horribly, horribly panned. So he went back to writing spy novels, which, and no one did them like he did. But being kind of rooted in this gritty realism, and also being kind of slow moving, and a lot of internal monologue, you wouldn't think that they translate well to films, but there have been multiple film adaptations as well as television adaptations and radio adaptations. In fact, there's only 2 or 3 Le Carre books which haven't been adapted into films. They can go either way. Like I say, the Little Drummer Girl film is very dull. I thought A Most Wanted Man was pretty dull. But they can be so tremendously exciting when they get them right. I thought The Night Manager was a wonderfully exciting adaptation of one of Carrie's more violent, adventurous novels. I would love to see The Honourable Schoolboy adapted. That's a great Somali novel that hasn't been adapted. Partly the BBC didn't want to adapt it at the time because it was considered too expensive. You're going out to Southeast Asia and all Hong Kong, Vietnam. All of these locations were considered too expensive. I will say that for me, the absolute masterpiece of adaptation, probably the best adaptation ever and one of the best things ever committed to film, is the 1979 adaptation of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy with Alec Guinness as George Smiley, and the follow-up, Smiley's People, also starring Guinness. To me, they are just perfect. You cannot beat that. And then a few years ago, when Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was remade for film with Gary Oldman as Smiley, it got some wonderful reviews. It got a lot of Oscar buzz, and I thought it was absolutely awful, beyond words. But and then I reread the novel and I realized in some ways that film had cleaved a bit to the novel. They brought in a few details of the novel a bit more. But that didn't do it for me. I felt like those adaptations of Tinker Tailor and Smiley's People are just so perfect that they took the story out to places and kind of made it perfect. And obviously it's a classic spy story. There's a traitor, there's a limited number of suspects, and you've got to go through the suspects one by one. So it's kind of classic story. It could be Agatha Christie if it was a murder mystery, but the television, the Smiley adaptation was just beyond perfect. It was almost transcendentally good. And the film, even though it brought in a few elements of the novel that the adaptation never changed or dropped, I thought it was sacrilege. I thought it was really, really bad. Ellroy is an Anglophile, so I think part of his admiration for Le Carre is rooted in his love of Britain and his love of Britain and America's shared culture, and broadly speaking, the values of the Anglosphere. So I think he really likes early Le Carre, like The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which is a kind of East versus West stories. And he never met Le Carre, but he met a number of famous British literary figures, sometimes with success. He's very fond of David Peace and Ian Rankin, who are equally fond of him. Sometimes with not so much success. He met Salman Rushdie at a party in the Cotswolds. He was introduced to him by his editor, Jason Arthur, and said it was kind of uneventful. But there have been a couple of disasters. He met Derek Raymond at a publishing party in France, and Derek Raymond is this typically British, caustic alcoholic, and tried to shove a bottle of whiskey into Ellroy's hands and to get him to drink it, and Ellroy was like, no, I'm an alcoholic, I can't drink. And Raymond was rather obnoxious. He was 3 sheets to the wind and wanted to get Ellroy to drink, and Ellroy had to push the bottle away and kind of very, very curtly put Raymond down. There wasn't my sympathies are with Ellroy there, but there was another one which Ellroy didn't look back on too fondly, because he was a little bit sheepish about it, which was he was sitting next to Ruth Rendell at a convention somewhere. I think it was in London, and Ellroy was getting a lot of. He was like the rock and roll star. Everybody was coming in for tea and for some signings, and Ruth Rendell was sitting there rather prim and proper, and not many people were coming to her desk. And Ellroy was making a big show of himself, and he looked back and he's like, he kind of winced at that memory. He felt like he could have handled that a bit better. But it was just one of those things. So he has met a number of well-known British figures, and there's one final twist to the story. Okay, back in 2019, when Ellroy was scouting for biographers, he had a list, and on that list was Adam Sisman, who had written John le Carre's biography, which Ellroy greatly admired, and they shared an agent. And Ellroy reached out to their agent to get a message to Sisman, and Sisman turned it down flat. And I often wondered about that because, I mean, obviously to me, being James Ellroy's biographer is a dream job. And if you haven't read it yet, Love Me First in Danger, grab yourself a copy. You know, it's pretty good. Actually, it's a masterpiece, but even if I do say so myself. So I got the gig as James Ellroy's biographer, and it was a dream come true. And it was, you know, the project was highly successful. And then it came out that Sisman had a horrid time as le Carre's biographer because he'd been spent a lot of his time just chasing le Carre's mistresses. You know, le Carre was a real Jack the Lad, and he was a real ladies' man, and le Carre had promised Sisman like carte blanche, you can talk to anyone, I'm not going to put any restrictions on you. And then in practice, he'd not done that. He'd interfered. Like some of le Carre's mistresses wanted le Carre's permission before they talked to him, and then le Carre wouldn't give the permission, or he tried to interfere in the interview process. And le Carre had wanted. He didn't want Sisman to do things like say, "Oh, my career peak was in the 1980s," which I have to agree with Sisman that it was in the 1980s, and that after the Cold War he kind of got too political and he became a bore. And he tried to control the project, and I think Sisman got just very, very miserable chasing these women. And something very similar happened between the two of us because one of le Carre's ex-partners, a mistress really, had written a kiss and tell memoir, and Sisman was furious about this because le Carre had kind of interfered and blocked that story from going into the biography. And right in the middle of me writing Love Me First in Danger, a kiss and tell memoir came out by Erica Schickel, one of Ellroy's ex-mistress. No, not ex-mistresses. Sorry, ex-partners. Sorry, Erica. And you know what is I'm going to give credit where it's due. The Big Hurt by Erica Schickel is a fabulous, fabulous book. It is very tender and beautifully written, very, very poetically written, and kind of sexy to start off with. And Erica is a sexy woman, and then towards the end, kind of exhausting and sapping. Like it's almost like the process of reading a book is like the process of being in an affair, where it starts off, particularly a kind of lustful affair. You know, it starts off sexy and erotic, and it ends up kind of just sapping you. So we had Sisman and I had very, very similar experiences, and I'm not surprised at all that he didn't want to go through all of that again, with Ellroy having gone through it with le Carre. And then recently, I missed out on the chance to meet Sisman because I was in Crime Fest in Bristol, where we were both nominated for the HRF Keating Award for Best Biography, and Sisman won, which good for him. It's a fabulous book. But you know, this book actually won the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best Biography recently. So you know, you put this on your list, your to be read pile. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Ellroy Reads. Do go back and read The Little Drummer Girl, and maybe put aside everything I've said about le Carre's complicated love life and the mistresses and all that, and maybe put aside, when I was reading it again, put aside where le Carre went. This is the start of the journey. I think he was much less boorish and much more nuanced in this than he became. I think it's one of his all-time great novels, and it's very, very important to Helen Canode. And I know that John le Carre's work, all of his work, is very, very important to James Ellroy. He's always been an Anglophile, and he's always had an admiration for this kind of slightly more British, the kind of grandeur of the British literary scene. I mean, maybe that's just self-delusion. I mean, Ellroy is who Ellroy is, and I wouldn't change it for the world, because his demon dog persona is outrageous, and it's very American, and it's very entertaining, and the last thing is respectable. But I know that this side of the pond, John le Carre, has always been a huge influence to him, and it was a huge influence to Helen as well. And she saw in Charlie someone very, very similar to herself, kind of, strong and independent-minded, but also conflicted and attracted to things very, very different to her. Okay, thank you very much for watching, and join us next week for another episode of ELLROY Reads. Okay, bye-bye.